Good evening. I'm Miriam Heyer, the Senior Director for External Affairs here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, and I want to welcome you to tonight's program, Picturing Auschwitz, in which we will learn about the so-called Auschwitz Album, the only photographic evidence we have of prisoner selections at the Nazi killing center. This program is presented as part of the museum's week-long series in commemoration of International Holocaust Remembrance Day. January 27th marks the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Each year, it is the day on which the international community honors the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust and millions of other victims of the Nazis. We're pleased to welcome Paul Salmons tonight, former program director of the Center for Holocaust Education at University College London, and the lead author of the UN manual, How to Teach About the Holocaust. Tonight's speaker has been at the forefront of research on how Holocaust education can help us understand mass violence and can strengthen efforts toward genocide prevention. Paul Salmons is also, most recently, a curator of the groundbreaking exhibition Auschwitz, Not Long Ago, Not Far Away, which will open here at the museum on May 8th. We've been honored to have him with us this week following our announcement of the exhibition, and we hope you'll take the opportunity to learn more by visiting the museum's website. And speaking of websites, I would be remiss if I didn't extend a special welcome to all of our live stream viewers tonight. Thank you for being with us virtually for the following presentation.
Thank you for the very kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation to be with you this evening, and everyone here, thank you for coming along on such a bitter night. It was so cold, right? I almost turned back myself, so thank you for persevering. I do appreciate it. I'm going to speak about these images, these photographs of Auschwitz, and given such a cold night, the term that I'm going to use for part of this discussion of these photographs is frozen moments. The way that an image captures a moment in time, it seems apt. But let's start in early April 1945 at the Nazi concentration camp of Dora Mittelbau. It's in Germany's Harz Mountains. That's the land of fairy tales, the fairy tales that were read to you when you were young, of Rapunzel and Sleeping Beauty. This is the landscape where those images, where those stories were first told, thrilled young children for generations. But in the period that we're looking at, it's also the place of the camp Dora Mittelbau, which in early April 1945 stood almost deserted. The SS had abandoned the camp to escape the advancing Allied armies, force-marching some 35,000 starving prisoners more than 200 miles deeper into the Reich, shooting thousands along the roadside that were no longer able to keep up. So in this deserted camp, in the tunnels and in the quarries, there was an eerie silence hanging over that place. 20,000 prisoners had perished there of exhaustion, disease, and starvation. Hundreds of corpses still littered the ground. And a handful of prisoners, the sick and the dying, too weak to march, still remained there. These are the few that the SS did not have time to murder as they made their desperate and disorderly retreat. One of the dying remnant, was a young woman called Lilly Jacob. Just 19 years old and sick from typhus and weak with hunger, she drifted in and out of consciousness until, roused by shouting from outside and the sound of cheering, with a tremendous effort, she dragged herself from her bunk, and her frail body staggered outside. As the first American soldiers arrived in the camp, the earth seemed to pitch up before her, and she collapsed onto the ground. Gentle, unseen hands lifted her and carried her to another barrack, one that had formerly been a barrack of the SS, and she was placed in a bed in that former SS barracks. It was the cold that woke her. As she climbed out of bed seeking some warm clothing, she found by the side of the bed a kind of chest of drawers, and pulling open one of those drawers and searching through it, underneath some folded pajamas, she found this object. Lying in the bottom of the drawer was a photograph album with a beige linen cover. Turning it, opening those pages, she found more than 200 carefully mounted photographs inside. The staggering thing is that those photographs were taken on the very day that Lilly herself had arrived in Auschwitz-Birkenau. As she turned the pages, she looked upon the faces of some of her own family, including these two young boys, her little brothers, 9-year-old Israel and 11-year-old Zelig. On other photographs, she saw the faces of her grandparents, Aunt Toba and her aunt's 4 young children, their rabbi, their friends, their neighbors, the people from her community. And there, on another photograph, in the front row, standing there with her arms hanging awkwardly by herself, was an image of herself, staring back at her from out of these pages. From 500 miles away in Auschwitz, 11 months and a lifetime ago. What Lilly could not know was that the immense personal value of these photographs would be equalled only by that album's historical significance. This single album, with these couple of hundred photographs pasted into it, which could so easily have been lost, hold the only series of photographs ever found that document the murder process at Auschwitz-Birkenau. That is the arrival of the trains, the selection process, sending people to either work or death, the long walk, the short walk to the gas chambers, photographs of sorting the belongings of the dead. All of those photographs, every one that we have in existence, contained within the pages of that one photograph album. And so those photographs, discovered by Lilly Jacob, are among the most important of the Holocaust, a striking visual record of the last moments of Hungarian Jews in the summer of 1944. They're so important, so valuable, that they have been used as evidence in post-war trials. And they are reproduced in museums and exhibitions today across the world, including in the exhibition here, the permanent exhibition in this museum, and also in the exhibition on Auschwitz that we created, which is at the moment in Madrid, and as you know will be coming here, we're very delighted to say, in May of this year. These photographs are reproduced and republished in countless books and articles. They've become the key source for representing what we might call the Auschwitz landscape. In documentaries, the camera searches them for meaning, focuses on small details of human interaction, lingers on the expressions of the people in the crowd, and sweeps across a scene to give some sense of scale. Hollywood directors go even further. They restage the scenes that we see in these images, using the photographs to clothe and position their actors as they strive to bring a sense of authenticity to their fictional films. And now, here again, they appear before you in this PowerPoint presentation. What is it that makes these photographs so compelling? Why do we return to them again and again. For theorists of film and photography, such as André Bazin and Roland Barthes, the photographic image has a special power to convey truthfulness. Where does that quality come from? They argue that it's from the very process by which photographs are produced. We have other images of the past, but a painting, of course, is made by the brushstroke of a human hand. The scene as it's depicted in a drawing or a photo or in a painting may never actually have existed outside of the artist's own imagination. But for a photograph to exist, it's created by the light reflected from an object in the world, or a scene that passes through a camera lens and onto photosensitive material. For Barthes, therefore, every photograph is itself what he calls a certificate of presence. In order for that image to exist, this image to exist, what we see there must also have existed. When we hold one of these photographs then in our hand, it can feel almost as if we are looking directly on the past. It's as though we hold in our hand a slice of time or a frozen moment. But if it's a slice of time like this, how far can an atom of time convey the full complexity of the past? Although it feels to us that there is this certificate of presence, this truthfulness, so Susan Sontag has argued that actually to have knowledge of the world, we have to understand how things function. That is, how they relate one to another over time. Yet in a photograph, we freeze time. Photographs, Susan Sontag may argue, lack explanatory power simply because they depict these moments rather than the historical processes that lie beneath them. And so a single photograph cannot reveal the interconnectedness between events. If photographs atomize the past, that means we have to make a special effort in reading them. We have to try to see beyond that frozen moment. We need to consider not only what each image shows, but ask, what else does it reveal? We have to carefully contextualize each image and relate one image to another to try to integrate these separate and isolated moments into a bigger picture of a larger whole. Each photograph, of course, shows what a particular photographer considers to be important. Each photograph that exists is taken for a reason, and therefore each, in a sense, can reveal its purpose. In these images that we find in the so-called Auschwitz Album, we encounter Auschwitz not exactly as it was, but from the photographer's perspective. We see Auschwitz through his lens. And reading that more carefully, it may reveal an attitude and a relationship to the events that we see and that are depicted there. Reflecting on that relationship between the photographer and his subject can actually reveal much about the ideas, attitudes, and the knowledge of the people at the time. But in order to do this, it's important to examine each photograph, not only for what the image shows, but also to consider what it reveals about the perspective of the person who took that photo. We need to think also about the unwitting testimony that it provides. What can we deduce or infer from the image that the photographer was not specifically intending? What does this tell us about the photographer's knowledge, experience, understanding of the place? What do the photographers reveal about themselves? And finally, we need to reflect upon the diverse perspectives that different photographs can reveal, different truths that can emerge and consider how they might relate one to another for a more full and nuanced picture of that complex past. So we're going to take a few of these so-called Auschwitz Album photographs together, and taking this one, for instance, I'd like you just to spend a moment studying that image and thinking, what does this photograph actually reveal? How do we read an image like this? What does a photograph like this reveal about a world so far beyond our own experience, beyond our own imagination even? What would you say the photograph is of? What's the subject of this photograph? It's not certain who took the photographs that were pasted into this album. But most likely it was, perhaps in both of them, two men. This particular photograph taken probably either by the head of the camp's photographic department, Bernhard Wolter, or his assistant, a former school teacher, Ernst Hoffmann. The main task of the department was photographing new prisoners when they, for identification purposes, the photography of other official work such as construction projects, and in 1942 SS doctors who performed medical experiments on prisoners also had those experiments photographed, along with cases of disease and disability that the doctors found interesting. It may be then that the photographs we see in this album were intended as a documentary record of the so-called work of this death camp. What is it we see? A train, we see, of course, on the right, has arrived inside the place we know as Auschwitz-Birkenau. A large crowd of people have spilled out of those wagons. If you look closely, you'll see that prisoners in striped uniforms begin to separate them into two large groups. Men and older boys on one side, women and young children on the other. They have heavy bundles slung over their backs. Those bundles hold all the belongings that they can carry: pots and pans, hairbrushes, cheese graters, toothbrushes, warm clothes. The things, the ordinary things needed for everyday life. These are the things that people brought with them to a death camp. What's that reveal to us about their knowledge, their understanding of what was happening? But the subject of the photograph, of course, is not that individual experience, is it? If you look at the way the photo is composed, the individual people are of little interest to the photographer's gaze. This type of photograph we would describe as a tableau. Yeah, the subject is not the individual person, but the scene as a whole. It's different from a portrait. Yeah, the images that we saw before. This is not a tableau. The photographer is interested in these two children. They're the subject of his lens. But here it's a different kind of record, a different kind of image. Not interested in the individual experience, a scene is laid out before our eyes. Consider the photographer's position. Yeah, he's chosen an elevated place. He appears to be standing on the train itself. It's one of the things, of course, which gives us a clue to the identity, that someone is able to do this. Someone can take photographs here. This is not a clandestine photograph. photographer is exposed. This has been done with permission. This is an official photograph. It's carefully composed. It's a professional photographer. They understand. This is not done automatically, of course, with cameras of that time. This is someone who knows what they're doing, who would have used a light meter to register how much light would be coming into that camera. And so depending on how long the shutter would remain open, what split second, how much light would have to come in for it to be correctly exposed. And so they would adjust the aperture of the camera, the hole which would allow the light inside, to the exact amount that would get the correct amount of detail in the photograph. But varying that aperture, whether you have a smaller or wider aperture, also affects your depth of field. By which parts of the image are in focus and which parts are blurred. In a portrait, you might want to use a wider aperture because it throws the background out of focus. It can make the subject of the photo, the portrait, stand out more. A photograph like this, you want detail in the distance as well as in the foreground and the midground as well. So he probably would have chosen a smaller aperture, which requires the shutter to be open a little bit longer. Okay, that means you can't do that if there's a lot of movement because things will blur. So you have to have the right balance, in other words. It's not a simple choice. This is a well-taken photograph, carefully composed, well exposed. So there's a deliberate act here. This person knows what they're doing. It's not a snapshot. See what I mean? You can read the photograph to learn something about the person who took it. Thinking about how it's composed, there's actually some classic elements in composition which have been used here. The way that the train leads your eye into the image. The strong line of the train takes your eye from the foreground through the middle ground to the distance. It's a deliberate choice. He's ensured that certain elements are visible within the scene. If you follow that train line, if you follow the train tracks from the left and the train itself from the right, they're converging, right? So that also draws your eye down. To the left and to the right, you'll see a building on each side with a tall chimney. Again, I'd say this is deliberate. The building on the left with the chimney is crematoria 2. The building on the right is crematoria 3. So the subject of the photograph is not the individual person or the individual experience, but a tableau which documents a process. So although Sontag, of course, is right that each photograph is only this moment in time, and that to understand the world, we need to understand how things connect over time. If we read an image carefully, you can sometimes see time passing within a frozen moment. Because we see the direction of travel in this photograph. We see the purpose of what's happening here. We see the fate of the people who are depicted in the image. The train indicates a journey. These people have come from somewhere, laden down with the possessions of a life lived. There's a hinterland there, there's a background, there's a community. People have arrived, and the moment is of unloading and separation. The direction of travel is towards the gas chambers. So this one single photograph narrates the process of destruction. It shows arrival, direction of travel, and the place of murder in a single moment. We can escape the frozen moment of time. That's the photographer's interest, right? Are we trapped by his gaze? Are we forced only to see the past as this Nazi photographer saw it? To some extent we are, right? But we need to make a little more effort. Look more closely at the image. He's not interested in the individuals, and yet in this broad sweep of event, when the image is studied more closely, the individual experience does emerge. It's the unwitting testimony of the photograph. I've tried to identify just a few of those moments for you. Look closely at the circled areas. You'll see on the left-hand side a mother carrying her baby, her small child. A little closer to us, still on the left, a woman and perhaps a young boy have linked arms. Yeah, there's a relationship there. On the right-hand side, a slightly further part of that image, someone seems to be helping another with this heavy bundle, or this pack. There's some, again, human interaction there. There's some care there. There's some relationship which is happening. A little bit below that photograph, that part of the photograph, can you see a young boy staring back at you? Yeah, there's someone gazing directly into the camera's lens. He sees the photographer and he looks at the moment that the photograph is taken. The photographer's not interested in him, but the boy is interested in the act of the photographer. Yeah, he emerges if you look closely enough for him. Finally, to the left of that young boy, can you see a man in a striped uniform talking to a woman with a headscarf there? The man is one of the Sonderkommando, one of the prisoners. They were forbidden to speak to new arrivals other than to tell them where to stand, to tell them what to do with their baggage, to go to this way or that way. A few kind of cursory words. If you look at that frozen moment and their body language, it would appear that something more is being said there. Yeah, there's a moment maybe of intimacy or of something else which seems to be being said. It's not just a direction that seems to be given here. And yet that was forbidden. One of the prisoners then, who we can identify, his name was Heinrich Price, is standing in the foreground in his striped uniform in conversation with a young woman. While the image captures only a slice of time, and we cannot tell for how long they talked, their body language indicates that Price is not simply directing where the woman should stand. More appears to be happening here. We do know from other sources that some Sonderkommando whispered hurried words of advice, telling young mothers, for instance, to pass their babies to a grandparent, or a young boy to say that he is older, that he's 18, and that he's learned a trade, and that would be useful in the camp. A few words, not enough time for explanation, and so barely understood by the new arrivals, but which might help them pass the selection. Is Heinrich Price caught here giving some words of advice to this young woman? A moment unnoticed by the photographer, but still caught unwittingly in his lens. I mentioned the two buildings on the left and the right, Crematoria 2 and Crematoria 3. Note also that in the mid-ground on the left-hand side is a single-storied building. It's somewhere before or opposite this building that the selection is taking place to decide who would go to work in the camp and who would be sent straight to the gas chambers. And that same building, if you identified it in the Yeah, you can see it in this one. Yeah. The photographer then has moved. Yeah, this is again why we think perhaps it appears to be recording, documenting the process of destruction. Yeah, a careful choice has been made. The photographer has moved along the train to where the selection is taking place. Here, a group, you can see for yourself, a group of men stand before an SS doctor. Think of the weather on that day. You can see something. This is the summer of 1944. You can see from the light, it appears it's a hot day. The men in uniform are all wearing their caps and their hats. It shades them from the sun. None of the men lined up before them are wearing hats. Yeah? If you look in their hands, they're all holding their hat in their hands. There's an issue of power here, of control. How long does it take for that doctor to decide on the fate of the man standing in front of him? How long does he spend deciding whether this person goes into the camp for hard manual work? Not chosen for life, they were expected to perish there, but chosen for work or being sent straight to the gas. How long does the doctor take to consider that decision of life and death? It's difficult to say, right? Because again, we have a frozen moment of time. But look more closely, and although time is frozen in the stillness of the image, we can see the length of time it takes for each decision to be made. Even in that still image, note the distance between each group of men as they walk from the selection process, this choice, this moment being made, towards that low building in the background, and from there to the column of men at the top right of the photograph. Those men are on their way to the gas chambers. The gaps separating each group show the short distance that's walked in what must only be a few seconds that it took to decide who would live and who would die. What does that tell us about the value of a human life in this place? One doctor could make that decision hundreds, even thousands of times in a single day. A cursory examination, a wave of his hand, sent men, women, children, and babies to their deaths. Today, as I said, the images from the Lilly Jacob album, this Auschwitz album, are used in museum exhibitions, books and films the world over to convey something of the horror of what was happening at Birkenau. But how effectively does this photograph really depict the atrocity? How long do we think, when a visitor is passing through a gallery, how long do they take to stop and study the image? Does she or he wonder who these men were? Their personalities, their lives, their loves, their dreams? Do we spend any longer considering these men than did the doctor making the selection? Or do we share the gaze of the photographer and see only an anonymous crowd being processed, only the power and the actions of the photographer, of the perpetrator? Elsewhere, on other pages from the album, we do see other individual portraits. We've already mentioned Israel and Zelig. This is one of the most commonly reproduced photographs from the 200, more than 200 inside that album. Why is that one of those that is so often selected? You know, in an exhibition or in a book, you might only have 2, 3 photographs. In an exhibition, 5 or 6 out of 200. this one appears again and again and again. What is it about that photograph that causes curators and writers and documentary makers to return to this portrait? Perhaps it's because of the poignancy of their connection to the young woman who discovered the album. It's a remarkable story, right? By chance she finds this album. She opens the pages, she sees her brothers. Perhaps it's because of the innocence that these two young boys represent. It may be that curators, authors, and publishers reproduce this image because they feel it is the one with which their audience will most easily connect. This is the one that will evoke strong feelings of sympathy with the victims. But that, of course, marks radically from the intention of the photographer who took the image. It's not what was in his mind when he directed the lens at those two young boys. So sometimes this is an image which is harder to see, in a way, the action of the photographer or the purpose of the photographer. Because when we see it, we see something very differently than the photographer had in mind. If we want to understand how the man taking this photograph saw these people, we might choose a different portrait, such as those on this page from the album. These photographs are far more rarely reproduced. Inscribed on this page is the caption, "Nicht mehr einsatzfähige Männer." Men no longer of any use. At the top, on the left-hand side, is a portrait of a Jewish man. He sits awkwardly in a cane chair and looks uncomfortably into the camera. He knows, of course, why he's been picked out of the 3,000 or so people to be photographed. He knows that his size has made him a kind of object of curiosity to the photographer. What we don't see is what he sees, but you can imagine it. An armed and uniformed SS man has, again, we said this is a professional photographer. It's not a snap. He has dropped down, perhaps on one knee, to be at eye level with this man sat in this chair, just a short distance away from him, and aimed his camera at him. The power dynamics here couldn't be more explicit. There's no question, of course, of permission being asked. The photograph is simply taken. At other times, in other places, it's likely that this man's physical size attracted other unwanted attention. But at least in those situations, he could have responded in some way. Here, in Birkenau, he is emasculated, he is humiliated. Photography becomes a brutal and degrading act, an exercise of power accompanied by the constant threat of violence. The photograph on the page at the bottom, same page, shows another group of people, these who are unable to walk the short distance to the gas chamber. So they've been placed to one side and they're allowed to sit on the ground. You see elderly people, you see walking sticks. They sit to one side as the selection continues. They won't slow this process down then, right? Afterwards, an ambulance with a red cross painted on its side, a deceptively reassuring sight, of course, an emblem of our so-called civilized modern world, will collect them and drive them a short distance to their deaths. This group also includes some of Lilly Jacob's close relatives. In the middle of the photograph, 4 people are seated next to the train. The elderly couple on the left are Lilly's grandparents, Abraham and Lilly Jacob. But why is this image then less reproduced than that of Lilly's younger brothers? Are the people here any less innocent? Is their murder any less of an outrage? Much representation of the Holocaust is intended to help the viewer to identify with the victims. The photograph of the young brothers, Israel and Lilly Jacob, undoubtedly evokes compassion and sympathy, for they appear not so different to children we all know. It's easy to feel a sense of identification with them. But shouldn't we feel an equal horror at the mistreatment and murder of people who may appear quite different from ourselves? Let's again look a little closer. On the left, the furthest to the left, an elderly religious man, his head covered and a scarf tied around his face. We don't know his name, and yet his appearance speaks simultaneously to a long cultural history, a horrific act of brutality, and to a form of spiritual resistance. Again, contained within this one still image is a longer history, a longer period of time. We can see beyond the frozen moment. His head is covered by a kippah, a circular cloth cap by which he honors his God. Many Jewish men who followed traditional religious custom grew their beard from young adulthood. It's likely that this elderly man had worn a beard all of his adult life. It was a mark both of his personal and of his religious identity. But it's evident from the scarf that recently, again that passage of time, he's been physically attacked. This elderly man has been degraded and brutalized. We have other photographs from a number of towns where German soldiers forcibly cut the beards of religious Jews for sport. After this violent attack, we might expect he would do all he could not to stand out, to disappear, to not draw more attention to himself. And yet, rather than going barefaced, he's tied a scarf around his chin, despite that making him far more conspicuous in doing so. Clearly, it's not the intention of the photographer to capture this mark of his resilience, even his courage, his defiance perhaps, by an old man who has turned an act of humiliation into one of personal dignity. And yet it's there, nonetheless, if we choose to look beyond the perpetrator's gaze, which sees only a subjected mass, and instead seek to see the individual human experience. In 2007, another astonishing photograph album emerged. The images it contains were also taken by the SS, but with a very different purpose. A different purpose to those in the Lilly Jacob album, and these reveal different truths. The Lilly Jacob album, as I said, documents the work of the camp. The SS, we see in these images, are engaged in mass murder. They're uniformed men dispassionately directing the killing process. When we see them, we might wonder what kind of men they were, but really their lives and personalities are not the focus of the camera's attention, and there are few clues in the photographs themselves. As such, they can safely remain as the monsters of our imagination. Psychopaths, cold, sadistic killers, at best, unthinking men only obeying orders. The photographs in the Lilly Jacob album that we see here do nothing to disturb those sorts of reassuring stereotypes that we might have. They can remain safely contained within our imagination. The new album is shockingly different in this regard. This album overlaps in time with the Lilly Jacob album. It shows some of the same men who were intimately involved in the mass murder of Hungarian Jews, but now in a very different context. Some of the photographs in this album are formal occasions, a funeral service for 5 SS men that were killed in a bombing raid, a ceremony to mark the building of a new hospital. But many, such as this one, capture off-duty moments, the killers at rest and play. Here we see mass murderers sunbathing, laughing, singing songs, or playfully eating blueberries with the young women who assisted them in the camp. The effect is striking and extremely disturbing. We can no longer keep these men at a safe distance from ourselves. The anonymous and dehumanized figures of the Lilly Jacob album, here they appear much more like us. Many of these photographs, including this one, were taken at an SS resort called Solehütte, a lodge set amidst pine trees by the river Sola in a region that was popular with tourists before the war. It was an ideal base for hunting in the wooded hills, hiking in the mountains, and for outings to a nearby lake. In these photographs, then, we see the human face of those we struggle hardest to understand. Here are the same men who organized and carried out the largest mass murder program in history. Here they are socializing, relaxing, enjoying themselves as they take a break from the killing. It's striking to learn that they're still inside the region of the Auschwitz camp complex, just a few miles from Birkenau, where the smoke from their victims' burning bodies rises from the crematoria and the open pits. The album belonged to Karl Hooker. He's pictured here in the center of this photograph, at the center of this wooden bridge. His arms around 2 of a dozen young women who, laughing, huddle together and fall for the camera. The album itself appears to be a memento of his career at Auschwitz. He appears in almost every photograph. It documents his time from when he arrived in the summer of 1944, the same time when the other photographs were taken, the other album was compiled. He arrived as adjutant to the new commandant of Auschwitz I. Auschwitz was divided into 3 large camps and some 49 very different times sub-camps. Auschwitz I was the first, the main camp, as it was called, initially intended and continued to function as a place of terror of the Polish population. The new commandant of that Auschwitz I main camp, Richard Bayer, arrived in the summer of 1944, and he and Hooker remained there until January 1945, when the Nazis abandoned the camp. The population of the Auschwitz camp complex was the size of a large town. There were some 135,000 prisoners, 4,000 men in the SS garrison, spread across some 16 square miles, 3 major camps and a large number of sub-camps. Prisoners were forced to work on huge farms, in the German war industries, in coal mines and stone quarries, all of which required organisation and management. The adjutant's role, the role played by Karl Hooker, was, in the words of Beer's predecessor, a more famous commandant of the camp, Rudolf Höss, the adjutant's role was to ensure that no important event in the camp remains unknown to the commandant. No important event in the camp remains unknown to the commandant. So this man, who owned this album, knew everything in detail that was going on. Hooker was among the leadership and command control of the Auschwitz camp complex. He was close to the decision makers. He had full and detailed and intimate knowledge of the vast human suffering that was inflicted there. And yet, he had snapshots of himself at Auschwitz carefully pasted into the pages of a photograph album. What does that reveal about Hooker's self-image? How he felt about the position he held, his duties, his role as adjutant to the commandant of Auschwitz? Was this a man only obeying orders? Was he forced to take part for fear of what would happen if he would refuse? We might prefer to picture our perpetrators this way, mindlessly compliant or having no choice, as this gives us an easy explanation for why they committed these horrendous crimes. But this album surely gives the lie to such comforting misconceptions. Hooker appears on almost every page, beginning with a portrait of himself and Richard Bayer on the occasion of their promotions, and continuing with the visits of Nazi dignitaries, ceremonial occasions, and these moments of relaxation. This is an album celebrating the career and the so-called achievements of a very willing perpetrator. Karl Hooker, it seems, was a man who took pride in his work. After all, we do not preserve the moments, the photographs of the moments of which we feel shame or guilt. Indeed, it seems likely that Hooker was posted to Auschwitz in May 1944 precisely because of his experience, his vigour, his skill in the administrating of a killing centre, being drafted from his former position as adjutant at Majdanek to assist the new commandant, the relatively inexperienced Richard Bayer. Nor was Hooker the only so-called expert who was brought to Auschwitz in the summer of 1944. Several key personnel were identified who would ensure that the murder of Hungarian Jews, the family, for instance, of Lilly Jacob, would proceed smoothly, with lethal efficiency and brutal effectiveness. The founding commandant of Auschwitz, who I've already mentioned, Rudolf Höss, had been by this point promoted to the inspectorate of the concentration camps in November 1943. So he'd left Auschwitz. But now he was brought back as commander of the SS garrison to oversee the program, the murder of the Hungarian Jews, that was actually named in his honor, Operation or Action Höss, the murder of the Hungarian Jews. Höss was an energetic killer. He involved himself in all details of the murder process. He led visits to other killing sites such as Helmno and Treblinka to learn from their techniques and their innovations. Returning to Auschwitz also was Höss's former adjutant, Joseph Kramer. Kramer had in the meantime been posted to Dachau and Natzweiler concentration camps. Now he returned as the commandant of Auschwitz II, Birkenau, The second of the camps, the one where the gas chambers and crematoria were constructed, the killing site. The largest killing site the world has ever seen. All the men I mentioned are pictured together in one of the most striking images from this album. A group of some 70 SS men sing along together, accompanied by an accordionist who seems to sway to the music. In the front row are arrayed the leaders of Auschwitz. Karl Hooker is here again, prominent in the front row. On the far left, in front of the wooden railing, so you see him right in the centre of the image here. Immediately to the right, to our right, if you like, of Hooker, but behind the rail is Otto Moll. He's standing a little bit further back. He's the supervisor of the gas chambers. Otto Moll oversaw the people arriving at Auschwitz-Birkenau from the time that they got off the trains until the time that they entered the gas chambers. He welcomed and reassured them before ushering them to their deaths. Otto Moll was one of the cruelest and most vicious of the guards. At times, he threw living people into the flames where the bodies were cremated, or used human beings as target practice, shooting from a distance to test his aim. Leaning casually alongside Hooker, elbow resting upon the wooden railing, is the commandant of Auschwitz I, Richard Bayer, and next to him, in the centre of the front row, arms folded, Rudolf Höss. Just behind Höss stands that new commandant of Auschwitz-Birkenau, Josef Kramer. A little further along, the smiling figure of Dr. Joseph Mengele, who sent thousands to the gas chambers, but who is even more notorious for the horrific medical experiments he performed on prisoners, especially twins, who he selected at the ramp. What could have prepared these men for their positions at Auschwitz? Where do you recruit men from to do these kinds of jobs? What's on their CV? Well, Karl Hooker was a 32-year-old family man with a wife and 2 young children. Formerly a junior bank official, he, by this time, had become one of the organisers of mass murder. Before the war, Richard Bayer, who I said was the new commandant of Auschwitz I, he was a skilled confectioner. He made sweets and other delicacies. Josef Kramer, the new commandant of the death camp Auschwitz-Birkenau, was a middle-class boy from Munich who became an accountant. Now he was the commandant of the largest killing centre the world had ever seen. Mengele was an anthropologist and medical doctor. He performed obscene medical experiments on Jewish and Roma children and was known to the prisoners by the Yiddish phrase Malach HaMavet, the angel of death. A bank clerk, a sweet maker, an accountant, a doctor. The banality of their former jobs appears a shocking contrast with the killers they became. But then, what would be a normal career preparation for Auschwitz? Comparing the Lilly Jacob and the Hooker albums, commentators have been struck by how it was possible that the same men seemingly inhabited these 2 separate worlds, by how easily they moved from the mass murder in the inferno of Birkenau to relaxing and singing and sunbathing in the beautiful surroundings of Solothurn. But I think we should think that contrast in a slightly different way. The images appear strikingly different only when we again make the mistake that Sontag warned us of atomizing the past into separate and isolated moments. When we neglect her warning and fail to see how apparently separate moments actually interrelate, how each functioned as part of the same historical process. We need then to look beyond the frozen moments of the photographs of the ramp of Birkenau and the SS retreat at Solothurn, to understand that the two worlds we think we see were in fact integral parts of the same genocidal process. We approach this past with an understanding, of course, of genocide as an act of utter destruction. That's our experience, that's our perspective, that's our worldview. But we grasp the significance of the Auschwitz Album only if we understand that for the perpetrators, genocide is always an act of creation. Today, our eyes are directed far more at the site of Auschwitz rather than at Solothurn. The new exhibition that we're bringing here is called Auschwitz, right? Not Solothurn. Millions of visitors travel to the former concentration camp and death camp every year to try to understand more about the Holocaust. No one visits the site of the former SS retreat nearby. But for the Nazis, I would suggest that Auschwitz-Birkenau was actually of minor significance. The place that we focus on, the place that we visit, didn't matter too much to them. The death camps were not a goal in and of themselves. They were the means to achieve their utopian vision, a world without Jews. The images of Solothurn, these images, represent that vision. From 1940 to 44, some 50,000 non-Jewish Poles were expelled from Żywiec County, the region in Polish Silesia which contained both Birkenau and Solothurn. Farms, villages, whole towns were emptied of their inhabitants to make way for the settlement of some 4,000 ethnic Germans who were brought home to the Reich from Romania and the Soviet Union in the east. The expulsion of the Poles was brutal. Families dispossessed at gunpoint, sent for forced labour in Germany, or dumped in their thousands into occupied lands of the general government to the east, with no homes and no way of supporting themselves. Jews too had lived in the Żywiec region since the Middle Ages. Now they also were cleansed from this land, forced first into the ghetto of Sosnowiec, then later to the camp, the death camp of Auschwitz-Birkenau, where almost all were murdered. Through the expulsion of the Poles and the mass murder of the Jews, this entire region was being emptied of what the Germans called Untermenschen, the subhumans, to create a so-called purified living space for the Germanic people who were settled there. These horrors, I would argue, were made possible for the perpetrators who committed these crimes by the higher cause that they believed it achieved. The world inhabited at retreats such as Solothurn. Birkenau and Solothurn then were inextricably linked. For it was Birkenau that created the idyll of Solothurn, and it was Solothurn that gave the murder, meaning and justification. It was emblematic of that new world that the Nazis were creating. And as the killers relaxed and sang and played together, they created an illusion that what they were doing was right and necessary. In their camaraderie, they felt bound together in a common mission. And in the scenic retreat of their lodge by the river, they made the ugliness of Birkenau beautiful to themselves. When we look beyond the frozen moments, the real meaning of these photographs becomes revealed. Birkenau created Solothurn, a world without Jews, and Solothurn made Birkenau possible. Thank you. Not sure if there's time for any comments or questions. Yes, please.
I'll come around with the mic.
I'm sorry I came in late. I am a child of a survivor of Auschwitz who was one of the female co-conspirators that blew up the crematorium at Auschwitz on October 7th, 1944. Mm-hmm. And I was just wondering whether there were any photographs of that event.
Thank you for the question, and the story that you mentioned is one of the most remarkable and powerful of this history, so thank you for sharing it. Yes, even in the ghettos and in the death camps, there were times when Jewish people organized and resisted and fought back, even when the possibility of any kind of success, of course, was totally lost. I mean, it wasn't that they were realistically trying to survive, but they were perhaps choosing the manner of their own deaths. And as you say, even in Birkenau, even in Auschwitz, that happened. No, there are no photographs of that event. Very few photographs of Birkenau remain. I mean, I say very few. Very few of the only photographs that we have of the destruction, of the killing process itself, are contained in that one photograph album, some 200 photographs. The photographers in the camp photographic department, as I said, did photograph, or prisoners were made to photograph other prisoners as mugshots. So there are huge numbers of those mugshots, which you'll have seen as well. There were photographs of the construction of the camp and other formal occasions, other aspects. There are also, of course, aerial photographs of the camp taken by the Allies who flew over in summer of 1944. So we have a different perspective, a different viewpoint. And there are also photographs, remarkable photographs, 4 of them only, that were taken by the Sonderkommando themselves from inside the area of the gas chamber, not inside the gas chamber itself, but the crematoria buildings. From inside those buildings, taken of the view outside. Of course, they risked their lives to take those photos. So a camera that was smuggled in and one roll of film was smuggled outside. These 4 photographs were taken, and they're radically different in their style, in the way that which they depict this, because, of course, these people are doing this clandestinely and at great risk. Sometimes, unfortunately, those photographs are displayed cropped so that your eye gets drawn to the kind of key detail. But actually, part of the detail should be the things which we wouldn't normally frame in a photograph, like the doorway, for instance, because it shows the danger that they were facing. There's even one of the 4 photographs, often referred to as the black photo, which is a sort of failed photograph, if you like. It doesn't capture anything, perhaps some trees. It's black and white, but maybe the branches of trees against the whited out sky. It doesn't show anything, and yet it shows everything. Because it's maybe a more adequate representation of the horror and the danger and the fear that these men were feeling than a beautifully framed, carefully composed photo. So these different photographs, again, depending on how we read them, depending how we look at them, can reveal these radically different kinds of images of the same place at the same time, one summer really in 1944. But regrettably no photographs of the event you're describing. What we do have are documents that were buried by the Sonderkommando in the hope that maybe one day they would be found. Zalman Gradowski, one of the Sonderkommando, and some others as well, wrote documents and buried them in a kind of aluminium flask. And they write, dear finder, writing to us, writing to generations afterwards, search everywhere. Because there are documents like this and others that we, the Sonderkommando, he says, have hidden here. They're buried in the ashes of Auschwitz, in the soil of Auschwitz, with the ashes of the people who'd been cremated. He writes that they'd even deliberately taken human teeth and spread them around so that the traces of the dead could be found. And one of the things that he writes about also is the planned revolt. So we know about the revolt. He was involved in the revolt himself as well, and he perished. None of those that were part of the Auschwitz uprising survived, of the uprising itself. Your family story is remarkable in that. Thank you. Any other thoughts or comments, questions? Yes, please.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about how this all had to be. It's interesting how you talk about how these had to be done in such a clandestine way. Like I remember reading about the Kovno diaries, how those were buried and found after the war. And when the exhibit here of the Lodz Ghetto, the photographer, again, as you said, at great risk, the notes were that he hid in a shed for like 6 hours to take these photographs through a slat, which was amazing. So it was documented. So I was just making these comparisons to other exhibits as they related to what you just presented.
Absolutely, it's very powerful, and I think it's one of the things we have to work hard in the field of Holocaust studies and remembrance and education and memorials, exhibition building, that although the vast majority of the evidence that we have, photographic and documentary, comes from the perpetrators, that we work hard to not only represent that past with their viewpoint. And these sorts of stories, these kinds of evidence are precious for that we have to make sure that we restore something of the agency of the victims, that this is not 6 million people that were murdered, but one person who was killed again and again, and another person and another 6 million times. And each of those people were responding to an unfolding genocide, usually with very little knowledge or understanding of what was going on, with very limited resources, with very small options, but as best they could. And these images, these stories, and those that you mentioned, of people that chose to document what they could of their experiences, is brought into even more significance, I think, when we do think of the words of the perpetrators themselves, such as Heinrich Himmler. Himmler in 1943 gave a speech to SS men in Poznan, congratulating them on the work that they were doing. He said, for one moment we will speak about these events. That he says we should not talk about elsewhere, because he says other people won't understand. Yeah, they kind of agree with it, he says, but they don't want to know about it. But here with us, he says, those men who have seen, they know what it's like to see 100 or 500 bodies on the ground. He says, we'll speak about it. And he congratulates them for it. He tells them that they have made themselves hard and remained fundamentally decent men. But he also says, this is a page of glory in our history that must never be written. You know, this idea about keeping it secret. It's ironic in a way. We have the recording of him saying it. He liked to be recorded. So we actually have him saying those words. But, you know, he said this will never be written. And yet others were writing that history. At the moment that he was giving that speech, at the time in which people were already under, from his order, going through the killing fields of Eastern Europe, digging up mass graves and burning the bodies to hide the traces of the evidence. At that same moment, people in the ghettos, in the camps, in hiding, were recording what they could. And we do have some fragments of their memories too. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, a new film, which I'm hoping to see myself tomorrow, about the Ringelblum archive in Warsaw, right? Absolutely. Sorry, does someone want to pass you the microphone? Because I think the things that you're saying should be captured as well. Sorry to interrupt you, but would you mind just saying those last words again?
Yes. I was saying that. I was very taken by what you said about what we as an audience bring when we, to looking at a photograph, because clearly what I bring to what I see is very different than the rest of the audience who were not children of survivors. As when I was watching Who Will Write Our History, my mother having survived the Warsaw Ghetto, knowing Ringelblum and being one of the part of the uprising. I had a feisty mom. But, clearly what I brought to watching that was I was searching for her in what I was seeing, and that's clearly different than an audience. I was looking for my grandfather and my relatives and trying to see, oh, that kind of looks like her. Was that her? So that also, in a way, distracted me from, the film. But we all bring something different, and I'm very mindful of what you just said, because that's part of the memory of the Holocaust, is keeping it alive for different people.
Thank you. That's very powerful, and I think you're absolutely right. It's one of the things we should remember whenever we see a new representation of the past as well, of course, that it's not a window on the past. It's not the past as it was. It is the way it's been reinterpreted by the person who produces that. So the wonderful exhibition that you have here, which will be replaced by this new exhibition, Auschwitz, is another interpretation of that past. But the thing which we would hope all visitors would bear in mind, that for better or worse, it's the viewpoint of the curators. We have a wonderful team of colleagues that worked very hard on that, but it's not the final word, right? It's only one version, one interpretation, the selection that we were able to make. And it's the same for any film that you watch, or any book that you read, or any talk that you come to hear. It's not the past as it was. It's always reflecting the interest, the positionality, the perspective of the person who has constructed that version. And it's those many truths which I think is so valuable. And I hope young people also, in their education, learn to weigh those different truth claims against each other and have some sense of how to use the evidence. It's why I've been looking so closely at these photographs, not just to see them as a window on the past, a depiction, an illustration of the past, but how do we read them as evidence? How do we discern meaning? And what do we find inside them? So thank you. Yes, please.
So I have two questions, if that's okay. So first of all, you were talking about a photograph of Lilly's brother. why do you think is this one used so much in different exhibitions and works regarding the Holocaust? And my second question would be, what kind of educational potential do you see in the Auschwitz album and in the Höcke album?
So why is the album used so much? Because it is the only source.
Not the album itself, but sorry to
Sorry,
interrupt
go
you,
ahead.
but the photograph of her brother.
Oh yes, the one of her brother. I think I alluded to it in the talk. I think a number of reasons. I mean, I think there's that personal connection with Lilly herself. That's something which is staggering and striking to us. The poignancy of that she's looking back on the faces of her murdered brothers. There's something in that I think we hold on to. The fact that they're children, of course, conveys innocence and loss. 90% of all Jewish children in occupied Europe were murdered during the Holocaust. 90%. So they represent something of this, right? So a number of reasons. But also I think, in my mind, my interpretation of that is also because it's an easy way for the curator or the publisher or the documentarian to engage their audience. It's something we know that people will relate to. And so that was my critique of that use, in a sense, was not that we shouldn't use that photograph, but we should work harder to see the humanity of those that are sort of less like ourselves, or less obviously sympathetic, in the sense that because of the way they've been photographed by the Nazis. And the educational potential is enormous and rich, huge. It depends what question you're asking, though. Education is, of course, not really about the accumulation of facts and details. It's about interpretation and meaning making. So I think one of the things in my work in terms of education is not to impose meaning on the past. From my point of view, it's not about telling young people or adults or anyone what this means, but working together to struggle to understand and discern meaning. I think that these give us opportunities to open a discussion. And some of you have already been contributing your thoughts, your comments. And what you will end up with any group of students or adults are often meanings or comments or memories or recollections that are far more profound than the ones you come with yourself. So it's that exchange, that dialogue, that development of critical thinking, where there is an educational purpose. Beyond that, of course, why study or learn about the Holocaust at all, if that's what you mean in terms of the educational value? And if you don't, I'm going to answer it anyway, because I think it's also important. If you are interested at all in how it becomes possible that people murder their neighbours, in huge numbers, how and why genocide occurs in the world, if you have any sense that this is important and you are hoping in some way to strengthen efforts towards genocide prevention, the first starting point has to be trying to understand what genocide was and is, and how and why those things happen, what kinds of warning signs there may be, what kinds of moments could be possible for intervention. These things are important, right? To me, anyway. And if you think that's important, then it makes sense, from my perspective, to begin with the Holocaust, not to end with it, but to begin, because the Holocaust is by far the most extensively documented, the most intensively researched, and the best understood example of genocide in human history. It should lead us to study others in far more depth also, if we want to understand patterns and understand how these things happen. I think the image of those two boys can be meaningful in reminding us of what the import of genocide should be for us today. Thank you. Thank you for your attention and coming out on this freezing night, and I hope you have a safe journey home and not too far to go in the cold. Thank you.